Thank you for those who have joined. We're going to give just about 30 seconds for everyone to get into the webinar. Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Emond, ICER's president-elect, and it's a real pleasure to be with you today to talk about the results of our third annual assessment of barriers to fair access, this time looking at coverage policies in 2023. For those of you who aren't familiar, ICER is an independent nonprofit health technology assessment group founded in 2006, conducting value assessment, which uses evidence in a transparent way to align prices with the benefits for patients and their families. At the end of the day, we do our work because we believe that there can be a balance between fair price, fair access from payers, and have enough revenue to fund the next round of innovation that we all want. So while many of you might be familiar with the comparative effectiveness reviews that we do to calculate fair price, today we'll be talking about our now third time looking at coverage policies from payers and pharmacy benefit managers to try to judge fair access. We'd like to acknowledge the support that we had for this review, for this project from the Commonwealth Fund. Many of you are familiar with the great work that Commonwealth Fund does. And we should make note that they are not responsible for any of the conclusions or decisions that we made in this analysis, but we are very grateful for their support. We're also very grateful for the entire research team at ICER that participated in this project. Both current and former employees are listed here, and collaborators. We benefited greatly from the input of our working group consisting of patient groups, clinical societies, pharmacy benefit managers, and representatives from the life sciences companies. We also had patient groups contribute information we were able to include this year for the conditions that were in scope. And also our continued thanks to MMIT for giving us access to their analytics market access database, one of the leading databases for information about formularies and coverage policies. All right, so on background, what are we talking about here when we talk about fair access? Well, it was a question that we tackled with our policy leadership forum, which are life sciences companies, health plans, and pharmacy benefit managers, groups that we bring together to tackle one big issue each year in drug pricing policy. Sometimes we've looked at rebates, we've looked at real world evidence. Well, a few years ago, we brought everyone together to answer this question: what is fair access? The result of that was the publication of our white paper, Cornerstones of Fair Drug Coverage. What does it look like to offer fair access? How do we know it when we see it? The goal was really to serve a starting point for dialogue and action to achieve fair access. And so after we completed this white paper in 2020, our wheels started turning. And we said, how can we translate this into a research project? How can we actually go out and judge individual formulary products to see how the payer and PBM community are doing in providing fair access? I'll also note here that all of the participants in the policy leadership forum, and it also included patient groups and clinical societies, none of them are responsible for the contents of our report or the contents of that white paper. Their input was invaluable as ICER made determinations about the criteria for fair access and as ICER determined what fair access looked like for this report this year. So how did we do our analysis this year? First off, we used that MMIT database to try to identify the formularies that we wanted in scope this year. This year, we decided to look at the largest and the smallest formularies by number of covered lives offered by the 5 largest commercial payers in the US. We also looked at the single formulary of the Veterans Health Administration, And we looked at the largest and smallest state health exchange plan formularies offered in the 4 geographic regions of the US. And this was to get at a hypothesis about whether or not there was any variation in fair access by region. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Every payer in scope was contacted and invited to provide us information on the tiering and the prior authorization and clinical coverage criteria documentation for the drugs in scope. If needed, we went to the MMIT database to look for supplemental information. This year, we included 18 drugs across 8 therapeutic areas, all reviewed by ICER in 2021. This year and last year, we took the approach of looking back 2 years to the drugs that ICER had in scope to see how the coverage criteria matched the criteria for the coverage policies matched the criteria for fairness. And that way we're trying to do a look back. Okay, we've judged these drugs on price. Now let's judge them on fair access. That's how we came up with those 18 drugs across those 8 therapeutic areas. So what did we look at? This is where there's some important limitations to this effort worth noting. While the Cornerstones of Fair Access white paper details dozens of criteria of what it looks like to offer fair access, there's only a handful of those that you can actually judge when you look at the coverage policies by payers. And that's because things like how long it takes to respond to an appeal, how complicated the process is to go back and forth when you're trying to get coverage for something that requires prior authorization, are data that are impossible for us to see unless we went and did a site visit or somehow had a database or some information from the payers themselves about that and those factors. So what we did is we focused on the things where we were able to judge them looking at tiering information and coverage policy information. So that was cost sharing, clinical eligibility, step therapy, and provider restrictions. And for cost sharing, it's important to note these formularies are used by many different plan sponsors. So if it's a PBM formulary, that may mean a health plan is one of the clients, so to speak. It also could also mean that a very large employer is the client. And those clients have the ability to set the cost sharing amounts. So all we were able to judge was tiering, which we acknowledge is a very unsatisfactory and unsatisfying proxy for what cost sharing actually looks like. But that's what we had to judge. And so that's what we did. And we'll talk about what we found and some of the limitations of that analysis. We also know that given the limitations of the ability to judge fairness of coverage policies generally, or coverage generally, that we would have a lot to learn by asking patients with these conditions about their access challenges. So we went back to all of the patient groups that were included in the ICER reviews in 2021 and invited them to share information they had. Many of these groups do a lot of work on access. They field surveys. They get stories from their helplines. We wanted to make sure we had an opportunity in our report to give airtime to those data and to those stories. And so those are included in this year's report. We also know, especially from talking to patient groups, that having more transparency about the coverage criteria and cost sharing of new therapies is incredibly important for prospective plan members. So we did an exploratory analysis to look at that transparency question this year. We wanted to, as acting like a prospective plan member, find out if we could see the cost sharing information about our drug, the tiering structure, the clinical eligibility, whether there was a copay adjustment program, and what were the criteria we needed to meet in order to keep on our drug that we were on now. And again, we acted like a prospective plan member. So this meant we didn't have any credentials to log into particular platforms. We'll go over a little of what we found with doing this transparency analysis this year. All right, so now heading over to results. What did we find? On an overall basis, looking at each of these 4 criteria, In the second column here, you can see how many policies were sort of in scope. There are reasons that the policy numbers vary there that I will mention. And then in the last column, you can see our judgment of concordance with those policies. And so what you can see here is the most variation actually happened with cost sharing. And now the N here is very small. The criteria that we judged is was for only fairly priced drugs. So, and the criteria says a fairly priced drug needs to be on the lowest relevant tier, or at least a therapeutic alternative does. And the reason this number of policies is low is because only 2 of the 18 drugs in scope this year were actually priced in the ICER fair price range. So those were only 2 drugs that were applicable for this criteria. And so you see a large variation in that concordance number. Only 62% of policies met that criteria of being on the lowest relevant tier. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about why. But you can see in other areas, and including provider restrictions, we actually found 100% of the policies being concordant with our provider restrictions criteria. That's a criteria that says basically you'd need a really good reason to require a specialist to prescribe a drug. And did the reason you give meet sort of our judgment of being fair? So for the 3rd year in a row, this is actually an area where we found the coverage policies that we reviewed to be 100% concordant with that. But you see in clinical eligibility and step therapy, we didn't have quite 100% coverage. So there was some variation that we'll talk about as we continue here. Step therapy was another area, both from our conversations with patient groups and our own experiences as patients in the healthcare system, that can seem rather frustrating for patients. Our original criteria here said that there needs to be a clinically reasonable explanation for why you would require someone to step through one drug before you get to the other. So that's one way that we judge concordance. But the other way, and this was criteria that we actually updated, again, based on feedback from patient groups, was how many steps are reasonable. In our first analysis 2 years ago, we actually found that some payers had as many as 10 steps before getting access to a psoriasis drug. And everyone on our team and the patients we were working with said there's no scenario where that seems reasonable or fair. So we decided, actually doing a literature search and talking to some experts, what is a reasonable amount, especially in a crowded class like psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis, and we set that number at 3. And so you can see here that we did have, for 2 different drugs, a few formularies that required 4 steps. And so we wanted to highlight where there's opportunities for there to be more concordance with the step therapy spirit here. It's okay to have step therapy if you meet certain clinical guidelines, but you also need to not make it too onerous for patients by requiring so many different steps. One little anecdote on this that was interesting in our back and forth with the payers, who did have an opportunity to review our draft results and give us feedback. One payer talked about requiring many steps in order to sort of, I want to say, enforce the clinical guidelines for treatment in that area. And what we gave as feedback to that payer was that might seem like one way to do it, but we think your clinical eligibility criteria, sort of the criteria that you need to meet before you can get access to the drug and meet prior authorization, is a more appropriate place to do that than in step therapy. Because what can ultimately happen is you're making it difficult and potentially more expensive for the patient to get access to that drug if you only are using step therapy instead of clinical eligibility criteria in order to ensure clinical appropriateness. All right, so now turning to concordance by drug. We don't have every drug listed here, but we wanted to highlight a few where we had some interesting results. And so you'll see here in the cost sharing column, these are the 2 drugs in scope that were judged fairly priced, so for which we judged cost sharing. So one is Benlysta for lupus nephritis, and the other is Nexlizet for high cholesterol. And what we found here was variation in having these drugs on the lowest relevant tier. And so here with Nexlizet, only 78% of policies met that criteria. And with Benlysta, you can see even a lower number, 47. Benlysta was one of those drugs where we heard that feedback that they were requiring, that was in the step therapy, but also the cost sharing. We heard from payers that because these drugs are expensive, they put them on the specialty tier, and that oftentimes the specialty tier is where every specialty drug goes, regardless of whether or not it's fairly priced. And we've pushed back on payers on this logic. We think that the most relevant tier for most of these drugs is the preferred brand tier, often a tier 2. I will note that for many payers, we did hear that the cost sharing between the preferred brand, like a tier 2, and the specialty tier was the same. So again, another limitation of our analysis where we are relying on tiering as an unsatisfactory substitute for cost sharing, because we didn't have any insight into how often it was true that maybe preferred brand and tier 4 had the same cost sharing amount. So put a little asterisk on that. That's an area we want to be exploring more deeply. We understand from our own experiences and from talking to patients, that the cost sharing piece is where patients really feel some of the unfairness as it relates to coverage policies. Two other things I want to note on this slide. ADBRI for atopic dermatitis is a place where we saw more variation than in other drugs on the clinical eligibility piece. This has a lot to do with how you judge moderate to severe atopic dermatitis. What kind of criteria are you using? Body surface area is one of the more common ways to judge the seriousness of a dermatologic condition. But it's also important to note that location of atopic dermatitis, even if it's less than a certain body surface area amount, is incredibly important to patients and can be quite debilitating to their quality of life. Think atopic dermatitis on your hands or your feet or your face. So this is where we saw some coverage policies that were not accounting for the importance of allowing access to this drug for patients who had moderate to severe because of location of the atopic dermatitis. The other place I'll mention are these last two drugs here, Soliris and Vyggart. Two drugs for myasthenia gravis. We saw the most variation in these drugs for step therapy. So this would mean requiring many steps before you can get to these drugs. And also sort of clinical criteria that sort of didn't meet the requirements of step therapy, right? So step therapy says it's clinically appropriate if there's no risk of harm, if you don't have a response, or if you've, tried previously a drug that doesn't work for you, you don't need to try it again. And so we saw some variation here in myasthenia gravis. Not a lot of hypotheses as to why, except for Soliris in particular. It's a pretty expensive drug. And so we might see some conflating of the clinical ways to approach step therapy and the economic reasons to approach step therapy coming through in these variation numbers. So we had a few hypotheses running into this year because we had different formularies in scope than previous years. One is, would there be any variation in concordance based on formulary size? That's why we looked at both the largest and the smallest formulary by covered lives for the 5 largest payers and PBMs. And we didn't see any variation. So that hypothesis was disproved. So then we had another hypothesis. Well, is there variation based on geography? Might we see things more fair in the Southwest or in the West than we do in the Northeast? And there again, we didn't see any variation. Most of the variation we did see was for cost sharing. But again, we need to interpret this finding with a lot of caveats because of the small denominator. Only 2 drugs in scope were deemed fairly priced. And as we reflect on some of the things we didn't find in this analysis, which was wide variation of fairness, concordance across all these different things, there are some explanations for why that we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about the limitations and the future direction of this project. So on concordance by condition, this should be no surprise after what we looked at by drug and overall concordance coming through. We saw the most variation and the highest number of policies not concordant with our fair access criteria in atopic dermatitis, lupus, and high cholesterol. Now, lupus and high cholesterol are driven by the cost sharing, given those categories had two of the drugs that were fairly priced. And then in atopic dermatitis, we talked through the clinical eligibility. Whereas for the other conditions, we saw very high percentages, if not 100% of concordance with the criteria, again, that we were able to measure. So now turning to transparency. With the transparency analysis, as I mentioned, we pretended we were a prospective plan member. And we looked at 3 drugs across 14 formularies. So Nexletol for high cholesterol, Invoke, and Vyvgart. We only looked at the payer formularies, and this was after conversations with both payers and PBMs, because the PBMs told us that they no longer post the clinical eligibility criteria for prospective plan members because it was causing confusion, because often the client, so this would be the health plan, was really the one ultimately for posting the information, because they are sort of purchasing the formulary, so to speak, from the PBM, putting their logo on it, making any other adjustments that they need. You might find that an unsatisfactory reason to exclude the PBMs, and I want to hear that feedback. Spoiler alert, we're looking for feedback on how we can improve this analysis in the future. But that's how we sort of sliced that loaf of bread this time. And like I mentioned earlier, we acted like a prospective plan member. We didn't have access to any credentials to get into client or member portals. And what we found with our analysis is opportunities for better transparency. While for all 3 of these drugs across the plans, the formularies in scope, we did see at least the tiering information for a drug that you might be on. We had wide variation in what we found in the other columns. And so here with the transparency of a copay adjustment program. Now, again, we weren't judging whether or not these policies were fair or a good idea. We just wanted to know, could you know that the drug you were on was subject to, say, a copay adjustment program? And there were some examples of payers that did a really good job of making this information clear. And so that would be helpful to a prospective plan member making a decision about whether or not to switch to a particular plan. We saw a lot of variation in the transparency of the clinical criteria. This is just, would I meet the prior auth, the utilization management? Do I qualify as having moderate to severe atopic dermatitis for this particular plan? Could we find that information? And so there was some variation there. And then in the transparency of continuation of coverage, we also saw that there was wide variation in how this information was made available. And this is the idea of, will I be able to stay on a drug I'm on now if I move over to a new plan, or do I have to go back through the whole utilization management protocol, stepping through other drugs that haven't worked for me in the past? And again, not judging whether or not those policies were fair, but can I at least see whether or not I would be eligible to continue on my drug? Would I meet those clinical criteria for continuation of coverage? The other thing to note that we found in our transparency analysis, a couple of things. One is, we are not your typical shopper of health insurance, right? Our staff are very versed in all of the jargon related to coverage policy and tiering and prior auth and step therapy. So what we were able to find might not be what the average consumer is able to find. The other, to prove that point, is that a lot of this information was behind the provider portal. And when prompted to say, are you a clinician? Our team said yes. Don't tell. And we wanted to do that just to see if the information was available in the provider portal that might answer some of these questions. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect that every prospective plan member would know that it was okay to go look in the provider portal. So the take home here is that there's an opportunity for plans to do better when they're posting information about the coverage criteria for their drugs, making it available very clearly to prospective plan members in plain English. One other note before we start shifting to what are we going to do next and taking some questions is to note that we did have one payer, after looking at our results in a draft form, make an update to their clinical eligibility criteria, bringing it in line with concordance. And that was for the atopic dermatitis drug. And it did relate to what I hinted at earlier, which is how are you defining moderate to severe? And so this payer no longer says moderate to severe is only judged by body surface area, and it includes the ability to get access to this drug if you have atopic dermatitis in crucial body areas. Again, think feet, hands, face. I've hinted at this throughout, but it's important that we're very clear about the limitations and the inability really to draw big conclusions about fairness of coverage policies in the US based on just this analysis. We know that there are many other criteria that are critically important to ensuring patients have access to drugs that we could not look at just by reading coverage policies. We can't judge how well these payers are doing at making sure that the appeal is done in a timely manner, or that it is a subject matter expert, a clinical expert in that field who's actually doing the clinical review. We also know that tiering is an imperfect surrogate for cost sharing, and that the choice of cost sharing by plan sponsor can vastly impact the fairness of access for patients. And also the fact that we had just the 2 drugs in scope for the cost sharing analysis, because only 2 drugs were deemed fairly priced. That was an update we did based on current sort of estimates of net price to determine if those drugs were fairly priced. And that's average across all payers. So it's possible that the payers in scope had either more or a higher or a lower net price than the average we used, meaning for a particular payer, it might be that there should have been a few more drugs in scope judging cost sharing. And then for some, maybe even fewer than the 2. And given that we don't know what any particular one payer's price is, we had to go with averages there. And it's very likely, if not like a certainty, that these formularies are not necessarily representative of the entire payer landscape. We looked at big payers and PBMs on the commercial side. We looked at one federal, and then we looked at the health insurance exchange plans. And so it's possible, if not certain, that the more you would look at the variety of the types of payers that we have that do either size or region, that you would see different results. So among the criteria we were able to assess, most payers are abiding by the criteria as we've outlined in our white paper from 2020, with the notable exception being cost sharing. We think we can continue to call for more transparency of the policies, especially for prospective plan members, but in addition, current plan members. Whether or not there's a copay adjustment program, how will I know if I can continue on the therapy I'm on now, and what will my cost sharing look like? Work begins now for our 2024 report. We will be looking at the draft plan is to be looking at drugs reviewed in 2022, such as those for type 2 diabetes, obesity, hemophilia A and B, the gene therapies. But we are interested in feedback. The fact that for now the second year in a row, well, it's the third year in a row of doing this report, we've seen very high concordance rates, but we know the lived experience of patients and their families does not match that really high percentage. So what are we missing? And so please think about what ways you think that we can expand and improve this effort to get at more of what's experienced by patients and their families as they try to get access to drugs. And so with that, I'm very excited to take some questions from the audience, and I will take a look right now to see if we have any in the Q&A box. We have a question. Can you please re-review what the criteria for concordance with cost sharing were defined as? Absolutely. Great question. There are several criteria for cost sharing in the white paper, but the one that we could judge by looking at tiering information is whether or not a fairly priced drug is on the lowest relevant tier. So if you think about a 3-tiered formulary, tier 1 is usually generic, Tier 2 is preferred brand, and then Tier 3 is non-preferred brand. Typically, cost sharing is then sort of adjusted for each of those tiers. Think $10 in Tier 1, maybe $40 in Tier 2, and maybe $100 in Tier 3, or a co-insurance. Our criteria says that if the manufacturer has done the right thing and picked a fair price, then the health plan side, the PBM side, should be doing the right thing and not have a big cost sharing burden for patients. And this is a way to ensure access. So we say, can we see that the drug is on the lowest relevant tier? There's a little bit of an exception to that. If it's a crowded class, it's okay for a therapeutic alternative to be on that tier instead, because that might be an economic step therapy choice made by the plan, that it could still be that the fairly priced drug is on Tier 3, but as long as something that's considered therapeutically equivalent and probably you need to step through is on Tier 2. So just to expand a little bit, I know I mentioned this earlier, but this is a really interesting area. What we heard from payers, especially that use a 4-tier approach where there's a 4th specialty tier, they often put every drug into that specialty tier, regardless of whether or not it's fairly priced. If that was the case, we actually said that was non-concordant. We think that the drug should be in the preferred brand Tier 2 in that case if it's fairly priced. We did hear, as I mentioned before, that some payers and plan sponsors decide to have similar, if not identical, cost sharing between Tier 2 and Tier 4, meaning that there would be no sort of advantage to moving it to the second tier. But again, given we weren't able to see what the actual cost sharing amounts, we still decided to judge it non-concordant if it wasn't on the lowest relevant tier. Great question coming in about the difference between pharmacy and medical benefit. When a drug is listed as both a pharmacy and a medical benefit, how might ICER's use of the predominant benefit type affect concordant results? Yeah, one of the decisions we needed to make was when we saw a drug that would have both a pharmacy benefit and a medical benefit policy is to say which one to judge. And so if for that particular drug, we saw that like the 80% of them were covered under medical, we would only look at the medical benefit policy, not the pharmacy benefit policy, if a payer had both. And the flip was true. If most payers covered it under the pharmacy benefit, but a particular payer had policies for both medical and pharmacy, we would have only looked at pharmacy. I don't really know what to make of how it would have changed the concordance results. I know that the few times where this happened and we just out of curiosity looked at the coverage policy on the non-predominant benefit side, the criteria were similar, which shouldn't really surprise you because it's sort of written by the same team, right? So it's the same company and the same approach to clinical criteria that they're applying. And so the hypothesis I will offer up is that we wouldn't expect to see big differences with concordance. The one area where this would come through is that the cost sharing approach on the medical benefit side tends to be quite different than the cost sharing approach on the pharmacy side. You will likely see tiering 1, 2, 3 on the pharmacy side, and on the medical benefit side you might see either no cost sharing for the drug or a straight co-insurance. And so concordance with fair access for cost sharing might be an area where, depending on which benefit we reviewed, the pharmacy or the medical, we might see different concordance results. We've got a question. Could you discuss any variation you found in clinical eligibility and step therapy requirements, regardless of whether the policy met the fair access criteria? Great question. I think that there were generally some variation in how the different companies approached describing clinical eligibility, describing step therapy, which drugs you were required to step through before you were able to get access. We know that a lot of that is driven by the negotiations between the manufacturers and the PBM or the plan about size of rebate in order to get preferred status. So there was some variation there. On the clinical eligibility side, we found that because what we were using to judge the fairness was basically concordance with leading guidelines and clinical expert opinion, that was pretty consistent across the different plans. And where we saw variation are some of the places we've highlighted. How do you define moderate to severe atopic dermatitis? This is something we actually talk about in our white paper, is that sometimes in an FDA label, there are terms that are not well defined. So then it's left to the payer to make that determination, to say whether or not something is fair, and whether or not something is clearly defined. And so we had opportunities to look at clinical guidelines and look at expert opinion to see whether or not the judgments that were made by payers to define some of these undefined terms sort of made sense and were consistent. So that's another area we saw just a little variation, again, mostly in the atopic dermatitis space. The lowest price drug based on WAC or net price? It's actually based on net price. And so we used the SSR Health database. SSR Health takes information about gross or reported revenue for particular drugs. That's net of all discounts across all payers, whether it's copay coupons, whether it's rebates, whether it's upfront discounts. And then SSR Health looks at volume data to back into a per unit net price. And so that was the proxy that we used. Important also to note, thank you for this question, that we didn't rely on our judgment of net price back in 2021. We updated that analysis at the beginning of this year using the most recent data for SSR Health to see if the price currently was deemed fair. So that would mean that a drug that we might have said was not fairly priced near launch or shortly after launch could now be judged as fairly priced if additional discounts and rebates have flown through the system. Great question. Does ICER reassess cost effectiveness for drugs included to determine current fair pricing? And if so, how? Really important question. The answer is no. We based well, yes and no. So we do refresh it based, like I just said, based on the current information we have on net price. But we don't go through to see if there's any new information that's been published about the drug, about its efficacy, its safety, its side effects. Important question, one that we can take back, I think, with ICER Analytics, our online platform, where it is a little easier to update information to see how it might, quote unquote, change the answer. It's something we could consider for future reports, but we're generally just focusing on the current net price to help determine whether a drug is still deemed cost effective. This is a comment that came in that I'm happy to share. There can be significant variation in how payers operationalize criteria. It may appear to be concordant online, but then the payer drags their feet. Couldn't agree more. This is a significant limitation of our report and why we can't just say that all policies right now are doing a great job with fairness, because how these policies are implemented can have a direct impact on how patients are getting access. So whether or not they received the fax and that you have to send the fax again, or do you need to fill out a very long form to get the prior authorization if you're the particular physician's office. It's an important limitation that we can't really see those data. Our report also talks about some of the recent news that we've seen about algorithms just denying claims that come in, knowing that there's a certain percentage that won't bother to try again, that's not actually using sort of clinical criteria to make those decisions. So there's great limitations in our report, in our analysis for sure, and then also more opportunities to think about ways that we can get at some of that. Another good one coming in, has ICER considered transparency on alternative funding programs as an exploratory analysis? This is a great idea. We're putting it on the list. For those who aren't familiar, alternative funding programs are things offered to big employers, so self-insured, to say, hey, we're going to take all your specialty drugs and we'll handle them all. And we'll manage the access and we'll manage the price, etc. And that carves it out from the pharmacy benefit manager or the plan who's usually responsible for offering access to those drugs. There are lots of opportunities for this to create problems from a fair access perspective. Again, hypothesis, we haven't judged this, but this one's going on the list. What does it mean to have another vendor sort of in the flow for a patient? Well, what if they're getting some of their drugs from a PBM and then they're getting some of their drugs from this specialty carve out? Is there coordination? Is everyone making sure that there isn't a important or serious drug-drug interaction there? What criteria are these specialty carve-outs using to judge access, and how are they matching up to the fair access criteria? I will encourage whoever put in this question, if you would think about emailing us directly, how easily you think we could get at some of those policies. Our cursory understanding here is that those policies are very difficult to find, whereas the policies that we have found and received from payers were incredibly helpful as we did our analysis. We don't think there's a ton of transparency with these alternative funding programs and these carve outs. And so it might be a barrier to trying to get at that. All right, we are coming to the end of the questions, these excellent questions that came in, and we want to thank everybody for their interest in this project. And as I close today, I want to do sort of final call for input here. We know the limitations of this analysis. We know it does not necessarily match the experience of a lot of patients and patient groups. And we encourage the ideas that you have for how to improve this project next year. As always, we were thankful for your engagement, for your great questions, for urging us to do better, and that spirit will continue. We'll have more information about the 2024 Barriers to Fair Access report in the first quarter of next year. And like I said, don't be shy. Feedback welcome on how we can continue to improve this. So my thanks for everyone for being here today. The recording will be available. I hope everyone has a great day.